enthusiasts, welcome to another exciting episode of the FoodTech Innovators Podcast, where we explore the transformative impact of technology and success stories in the world of food and beverage manufacturing. This week, our host, Steven Burton, who is yours truly, is going to sit down with Sandra Lazo from Brassica Protection and Laurent Dallaire from Innodal. Okay, thank you. So today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to actually talk about some sort of timely information in terms of the McDonald's outbreak. And there's a lot of media coverage on this, but it's mostly sort of from the consumer side. So where I'd really like to take the conversation is more from the kind of processors, manufacturing, food company side, as opposed to, the impact on actual consumers themselves. And just to give you a little bit of background, my company, Icicle Technologies, was originally founded because I got food poisoning. And it happened to me 3 times. The first time was in Egypt. I ate something I absolutely shouldn't have. I lost 40 pounds, was too sick to tell anybody I was dying. And it was a stomach parasite, though not E. coli. And, when you go traveling abroad to a country like that, where the hygiene in that particular place particularly wasn't very good, you take your chances. But in this particular, subsequent to that, when I came back to Canada, I had 2 more serious outbreaks. And after the third outbreak, which were both E. coli, I was like, man, there has to be a better solution for this. Maybe there's a technical solution for this. So that's where we set about building Icicle. And I have to tell you that for the last decade, I've been preaching from the top of every mountaintop, trying to convince food processors of the risk of foodborne illness. And all the time, people, I found a lot of resistance in the community. There's a lot of regulations, a lot of government that really wants to make sure that the food, that the consumers eat is safe. But a lot of processors take kind of a sort of laissez-faire sort of attitude about it. And but when you come to big companies like McDonald's, it's a bit surprising after all this time to see that, outbreaks still occur from them. So maybe we could start with you, Lauren, and just kind of give me a little bit of your take on kind of where this current outbreak is and what the ramifications are.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty big one, and it becomes very public when it's McDonald's, of course. As consumer, we're all feeling involved at some point in this incident. It's interesting because in that case, you kind of see the relationship between, let's say, a restaurant chain or a grocery with their suppliers, and a restaurant and the grocery really relying on their supplier to be the one taking care of food safety and making sure that it's foolproof. But at some point, that's I find kind of sad that you see Taylor Farms being pointed and being the sole responsible from this incident. But it's a hard one because you realize, it's slivered onions, simple as that, and you have a huge recall for E. coli. But at the same time, it's the simplest of food, but it's the most complicated one in terms of making sure that it's safe, because there's not much you can do. Slivered onion, basically, it's a raw product. It wasn't cooked. You can't cook it. There's no real proper kill step in this case. So it's going to be a hard one to find, let's say, a proper solution to make it to make sure that it won't happen again. But at the same time, you see that the relationship of force between McDonald's and Taylor Farm. McDonald's saying, okay, we're done with Taylor Farm. It won't happen again. But at the same time, Taylor Farms, there's hundreds of them. Everyone's in the same scenario. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't negligence in this case that caused this kind of event. So we'll see with the investigation, what was the proper source of the contamination. Was there negligence? But I wouldn't think so. It's just such a hard product to make sure that, there's no E. coli and it's not a problem per se.
Okay, Sandra, who, by the way, I've known for quite a long time, so almost since the beginning of the Icicle project, and I'd sort of characterize you as one of the gurus of food safety in this part of the world right now. We're located in British Columbia, Canada. I know today you're working with Brassica Protection. What are you doing there? You're also food safety for them?
Yes. So Brassica is a leader in research nutrition, and we have a product called TrueBroc, which uses its bioactive glucoraphanin that is an inflammatory, and it's been well used in nutraceuticals, dietary supplements, and food and beverage. So I am the Vice President of Quality and Product Safety, And as the role says, it means I ensure that supplier approvals, regulations, and the quality control and quality assurance is put in place, again, from the raw material to the finished product, right? So it's a big responsibility.
Okay, so that's great. And based on this sort of in-depth knowledge that you have of food safety, if you look at this particular outbreak with these slivered onions, that's a field crop, right? So it's coming in, I imagine, from the field, and there's birds and rodents and whatever, which could introduce E. coli. But there's a journey, between the farm and the kind of fork, so to speak, where the consumers are actually eating it. Where do you think in the sort of chain of custody, from the inception, from the farm all the way to the McDonald's drive-through window, do you think that the E. coli was most likely to be introduced in this case?
Well, it's like Laurent said, it means we cannot point finger to one specific area, right? When you have produce, that's already a risk. So it's either irrigation waters, the crops being contaminated, but it is every industry, every food service has the responsibility to do proper sampling. Right? Are we doing a square root plus one? What kind of sampling are we doing in the produce to ensure that the raw material entering our facilities is good? Are we using as well analytics? How much of this do we know? So it's complex. Many times, a misconception is food safety is only washing hands, but it's more than that. It's a strict program from the beginning, from the harvesting, from water that takes in all this process, right? And again, it means enters into the food service. What it is, it was a cross-contamination, it was a single crop. There is a lot of investigation that needs to be done. The most important, and I hope, is that we are learning for this. Are we doing proper investigations? Are we doing proper corrective actions? Because this is not the first time. And that is the challenge for the industry.
So do you think, just to sort of translate what you're saying there, I understand that it's not possible, actually both of you mentioned that it's really not possible to kind of prevent, there's no kill step involved, so there's nowhere to prevent the outbreak from potentially occurring. So you have to have processes in place to test and to check and to look at the analytics over time. Do you think that this was a failure on McDonald's part here, or is it sort of too early to tell?
Well, on my side, I don't think it's a failure from McDonald's. It's, once again, like they're working end-to-end into that. Both of them are partly responsible for what happened, because on one side, you have Taylor Farm, who's the processor, who's involved in the process actively. So clearly, he's the one, potentially who did the contamination or didn't see the contamination by not having a good sampling plan that could have prevented, let's say, this type of contamination. But at the same time, it's the kind of same scenario that we saw with Boarhead 2 months back, where Boarhead, they were audited by USDA, they were audited by third parties who checked their analysis. Everything was great. Everything was great at Boarhead until failure, until you saw the recall, until it was too late and too big. So at some point, yes, potentially McDonald's is responsible because their audit process was not perfect, was not able to point and see the contamination within their own ingredient that they buy from their supplier. So the responsibility is on both parts. One, the supplier making sure they have a safe product. The other, the buyer making sure, what the supplier is supplying me is safe. You can't just rely, and mostly in the produce, you can't rely on just what my supplier is supplying me in terms of certificate of analysis, because in produce, the volumes are gigantic. So to be able to have a perfect sampling plan on everything that you do, it's impossible. It's the mass is too huge. So it's a work that needs to be done on both sides, because once again, as Sandra said, produce, they're really at risk, and it's not like a niche product or a niche food product. It's just the onions, it's everywhere in tons and hundreds of millions of tons of product. So to be able to have the perfect sampling plan, it's going to be really hard to have the perfect one.
So are you saying that you think that it's not really possible for a company, establishment to actually control this type of hazard? Is this just something we need to live with? Or do you think that we things could have been done better?
Well, I think always we can do better. We have to use the data. Like Laurent is saying, this is not the first time it's happening. Something stringent needs to be happen at the agricultural level in order to enhance the food safety. I think now in early this May, there is a regulation from FDA where they are requiring from the farms, from the fields, to do a HACCP on their water, risk assessment. So what is it invested? What is the risk? Now, water cannot be, doesn't affect the same that affects to a lettuce, to a tomato, or to an onion, right? So based on their crops, what are they doing about it? Do we have to live with this? From the household, means we wash our produce, we wash our onions. We even have cutting boards. I hope we have, but it is also thinking that we have to live like that. I don't think so. There is so much that we can do. There is a lot of training that needs to be reinforced from the fields. From the fields, then you go to a food service, and sometimes we have busy kitchens. Are we doing proper cleaning to avoid cross-contamination? So it is hard for me to say, yes, we have to live with that. No. I think every time there is always something else that we can do.
And it's really a case of, it's risk management. The no risk situation is not feasible, but it's making sure that you manage that risk, that contamination by E. coli or whatever type of bacteria, it's gonna happen, but we need to catch it before it goes out the door, before it gets to the consumer. That's the goal. Contamination, it's gonna happen. We're fighting against living organisms. So of course it's gonna be a hard battle, but we need to make everything in place to make sure that we catch it before we eat it.
It's a good point, because we have a lot of people might think that kind of E. coli contamination is mostly from ground meat, but actually leafy greens, or I remember at one point baby organic spinach was one of the main culprits. So there's definitely a lot more to it than that. What about inspectors? I imagine you've been through an inspection or two, Sandra, in your lifetime. Is this a failure on the part of the inspectors to catch it? Should their oversight have been kind of more vigilant, or is that really not more of the establishment's responsibility?
Inspections can be third party, but can also be inspections within the same organizations, right? I think that inspections generally, they give you an overlook, but only the company itself knows their gaps. Because it's very difficult, in an inspection to see really the day-to-day challenges. If you have a program, you can always say, I'm compliant with all of these requirements. But it is the ownership of each facility to know, am I really in the food safety culture, right? So inspections can catch, yes, issues. You have to be detail-oriented and dig into the documentation. Just asking, do you have this and that? Yes, we all have it. We are preparing for these certifications. But you can really know the story by looking in depth, batch records, signatures. It's a little bit more of the detail in each inspection. And I'm talking about both. Inspections are not just done to check the mark of certification or the internal auditing in the facilities to say, yes, I did it. Look into the analyticals. I know by experience that the batch records tell you a story on your facility, your improvement, your gaps, what you've done, and what the company management does with that information. That's what takes it to the solution.
Yeah, I spend a significant portion of my life collecting those detailed informations and making the analytics available. So yeah, we're well versed for that. And speaking of the technological solutions, it's not only software like us, but Laurent, last time we spoke, you had mentioned that you had a technological solution for listeria, and you were working on E. coli as well. Is there some way that, going forward, your technology might help avoid this sort of mass outbreak of foodborne illness and hospitalizations and deaths?
Right now, I'm just biting my nails to say, shoot, if only it was available right now, it would have been the perfect timing, but once again, it's going to happen. And yes, so we have one technology we are finalizing, let's say, the maturation of the technology, and the goal is to make it available in Canada in 2025. It's the same type of mechanism of action where we use a protein that will target specific receptor on the surface of E. coli this time, to be able to have this very precise kill step. And it's going to be interesting to read those type of food processors, once again, where they work with produce, where it's not feasible for them to use kill step like cooking, pasteurization, a high pressure system. You can't pass those type of food in those systems. The only, let's say, treatment available are hyperoxidant like chlorine solution, peracetic acid, ozone solution, where yes, it works, but you don't want it to work too well, because if you overdose by a bit, it's going to create a quality issue your produce, because you're going to start to oxidize your onion, in this case, your lettuce, your leafy greens, where finally at the end you're doing too good of a job of a kill step, but then the shelf life will be reduced because you're just hyper-oxidizing the produce by itself. So now it's going to be perfect example where it's going to be an added value. And most of all, the moment that you slice, you dice, you cut, you process that produce, because once it's a whole produce, well, it's considered not as a ready-to-eat product. You need to wash it yourself. But the moment that you dice, cut, you're taking that outer membrane that is, of course, contaminated, and then you slice, and then you enter that contamination within the mass, the produce. So to be able to treat at that step specifically is going to be definitely a game changer for the industry. And once again, this event, it's not something new. We saw it a couple of years with the melons, where it was a recall for salmonella, where there was some on the outer surface, and the moment that they cut through the melon, where they were bringing the outer contamination within the inner part of the melon. So it's gonna be this kind of scenario is gonna happen in different type of produce, because once again, there's a limited options available to be able to act as a kill step right now.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you another question, Sandra. So Laurent mentioned that, one of the solutions was like a wash water chemical solution, chlorine-based perhaps. Seems like onions might have been a good candidate for that, because the onion itself is actually, a single sort of sphere. And you would imagine that the E. coli would have grown on the outside. Like, why couldn't they wash the onions in a wash water to prevent this before slicing?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you, Steve. I thought that would be the process. When we talk about the sliced liver onions, the first thing that occurs to me is this has been washed. So it must be washed. I don't know if the investigation says if it's being washed or not, but it's in processed vegetables. That's what would have had to happen. So you slice, you soak it in peracetic acid or chlorine water for certain concentration and certain time, and you would have been fine. So I don't know if these were washed or not, because if they were, the chances that we would not have been having this podcast, because, everything would have been straightforward.
But it's the same case when we saw the same kind of scenario with product like broccoli or cauliflower, when it's really complex structure that when it grows in the fields and it develops, you have like all these little holes where the rain or the water gets encapsulated within the produce. And same can be potentially the same thing with the onions, and it's even like a product that grows in the soil. So when growing, it can encapsulate part of the contamination within its let's say, I would say leaves or shelves in the case of the onion. So it's not surprising that it could be coming from directly the fields, and it wouldn't be surprising that if they wash the product as a whole, well, they weren't able to get to that critical part that was encapsulated within those leaves. But most than likely, there was a lack of step or a washing step at the slicing step, at the cutting, where it's really critical and the risk of recontamination is absolutely high.
Don't you think that might be a little unlikely, though, because of the scale of the outbreak? So if it was just, if there was a single problem with an onion, somebody might get sick from that. But in, 75 people across 3 or 4 states, it seems a bit unlikely that particular way. Could you see another way that might be able to happen, Sandra?
Well, it's storage then. But, we have one distributor of processed onions where the onions process in-house. If the distributor didn't have proper storage conditions, then that's also a probability, that the contamination would have gone through. True. It is a tough situation for sure to discuss because I understand that, any wash probably didn't have the whole effect, but I know that the solutions used have done studies and research on this too. So when, you have food services or companies using the solution, you ask for that's the validation of the product that you are selling. Show me how many logs reductions you have had in a veggie. So not having that wouldn't be total failure.
Yeah, then another thing that popped into my head when I first heard about the outbreak was that it might have been introduced by the workers who are actually handling the food as well. But the same reason I think it's unlikely that it came in from the field is the scope. Probably belies that, because if there was an employee who had an E. coli infection and then handled the food, then the people locally would have gotten sick, but it wouldn't have been a massive outbreak across multiple states. Although it could have been potentially a worker. But how likely do you think that might be, Lawrence?
Well, I just don't want to rule out yet the contamination in the field, because once again, when you're talking about produce, let's say you're harvesting a large scale field, the amount that you're harvesting, and let's say it's not, I'm not suggesting that it was one onion that was contaminated and one isolated. Like if you're using contaminated water to not drain but to hydrate the fields and put water in the fields, it's your whole field who's going to be contaminated, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of tons of product that's going to be contaminated at once. So I wouldn't rule out at all the chance that the contamination can come from the field. Once again, you have to imagine like the volume that is produced. We're talking about a supplier that is able to supply McDonald's as a restaurant chain. I'm sure that the field and process and the batch size are just tremendous in volume. And that brings another, let's say, it's going to be even the chance or the consequence is going to be even bigger because the volume are bigger. So just once then it's going to just propagate everywhere in large amount.
I recall also a few years ago there was an outbreak, I think it was romaine lettuce coming from Mexico, where it was exactly contaminated field water. But I don't know if actually the contaminated field water could uptake into an onion and contaminate the onion through the groundwater. Maybe. You think it's possible?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And that's exactly what happened also with the recall from the romaine lettuce in Arizona and California 4 years back. Water that was used to water the fields, it was a source of contamination. They were right next to a farm that was doing beef and cow, it's a processor. So right there you had the source of contamination as your neighbor, and then you're taking the same source of water to put water in the field. So it's not surprising that it could be the source of contamination in that case. But we'll see when they'll make the right audit. But there's two ways to see it, like really in the field or during processing there.
Okay. And Sandra, if you were a plant manager, I mean, you are a food safety expert who works in the industry, but if you were the plant manager or the owner, one of the things that it's occurred to me when I've talked to many, many people across continents about it is that they seem to underestimate the risk of this type of outbreak occurring to them. How seriously should the owner or the plant manager take this risk? And do you think that they're doing enough to combat the risk of foodborne outbreaks?
As I mentioned before, there is always more than we can do. There is a lot of follow-up. And you said people take too much risk. Oh, it's okay, it's a veggie, People even bring you, but, I don't wash my onion at home. And I always think, well, you should, Training. People are not focusing on training. There is a challenge with short labor. People sometimes bring temp. Are temps trained? Can you train food safety in 10 minutes to a temp for the day? Our companies are going to invest on that? I don't think it's happening. So it is training. And training is not, again, a checklist where I go and I grab all the company and say, oh, we should wash our hands and we should wash the proper utensils and tools and use color-coded cardboards. But it's an ongoing training. It's from the people that work in the plant, from supervisors, from management, from the QA team. It's an encompassed team that goes when you check the plant and you observe someone. Call this person. Call this person. It's 3 minutes. You're not washing your hands properly. You are putting something directly on the floor, or you are not washing the utensil. There is much more that can be done with training for sure. Then the fact that people realize if they do a strong environmental monitoring program where they swap for zone and do zone 1, 2, 3, 4, direct food contact surface or, the knobs on the offices. You take those swabs, you analyze the results, you analyze the data. How is that you are not really focusing on improving? Because you just don't do this to check the box. It's what are you going to do with those results? Are you communicating the results to your crew, to your employees? That is where the difference between industries and food services becomes very clear. Who is doing it and who is not doing it? Right?
Those are all excellent points. My original question was more around kind of the risk appetite. And do plant owners and plant managers take the risks seriously enough? Or should they be more concerned? What do you think?
Well, it varies a lot. And we've seen, in my short career in food, I've seen two extremes. I've seen, let's say, CEOs really putting food safety first, and for them, it's really important. And in the same type of food processor, another player, and you see management where they see food safety as an expense, not an investment. For them, it's going to be always yields, production first, and if we have time, food safety. And that's why we see like extremes in terms of policy, where you see company who have a great policy on paper, but then are they putting into application that policy? It's still hard to see. So we see two extremes where you have really proactive companies that put everything into place, that they do what they say and they do even more than that. And then in the same type of production, well, you see people where we've got so many times the saying, well, I never got a recall, so I'll never get one. No, that's not how it works. You'll get, with that attitude, you'll get one, that's for sure.
And when you've worked in the industry, let's set aside your current company, Sandra, because I don't want to get you in trouble with your boss, but in previous iterations, have you encountered resistance from management when you try to make recommendations for how to improve their food safety program?
Well, in my career and in times I have consulting, I think more than resistance are questioning. Why? Why do you think I should do that? How we explain why? But like Laurent said, there is going to be some companies where the yields and is taking too much time and they see us as an expense. And that's why it's important for quality professionals and food safety speak quality in terms of money. Because can someone recuperate from a recall? That's the imbalance that you have. And sometimes it's been tough to me to explain why it's important, certain things. But as a quality professional, we are accountable for it. So we have to explain why it's needed and what are the risks that people will take, and management will take if they don't follow these rules. I've been lucky to work with companies that product safety has been a top priority. And I have learned from those. I have other ones that have not been there and didn't stay long. So it's how much, I'm me, Steve, it means food safety for me. It's always been a priority, and that's been my signature. So I think that when people hire me, they know that's what comes with me. So you have to follow.
Yeah, makes sense. And just to put in a plug for the Canadian food industry, I think our our foodborne illness outbreak rate is about 25% less than in the United States. So our food is generally safer as a result of people like yourself, I imagine, both of you guys. So another thing I just wanted to touch on briefly that occurred to me after we were discussing, we actually don't know what caused this outbreak, but, it could have been the groundwater contamination, which is an interesting hypothesis. But shouldn't that be tested? Like, I know in our software we have a lab testing piece where you can do the testing, environmental testing. Shouldn't it, if it was contaminated groundwater, shouldn't it have been picked up by an environmental water testing program?
Well, depends on the industry. It's the amount of water that you use is what you will place your environmental monitoring. You test water. If water is a main ingredient, then you have to have at least quarterly or monthly checks, right? I think that in farms, they have the annual testing. It doesn't tell you too much, right? But if you go with a risk assessment, what the FDA is trying to reinforce these days is if your water is on risk because of where it's located, then you probably will have to take more samples and do more testing, right? It should have been tested for sure. I could be saying that I'm totally sure that Taylor Farm had the test, but probably it wasn't enough,
So just in that vein of thought, maybe I'll ask both of you guys, starting with you, Sandra, what advice would you give for companies looking to improve their food safety programs and reduce the chances of this happening to them? Because if this kind of a recall does happen, like one thing I've noticed in the industry is that companies tend to be sort of underestimate the risk because oftentimes it's an extinction level event for the company. So as a result, there's not a lot of companies around that have experienced something like this because they're all gone already because the financial implications and sometimes criminal and financial penalties are so high that they simply can't survive. So what advice would you give for companies to mitigate this risk?
I would say to look into their data. Look in their data of previous gaps, invest on training, never overlook training, enhance food safety culture. Food safety culture starts from the top. If you see someone not following that and it's from the top, you cannot expect that from employees following. They are going to say, why I would do it if this person is not doing it? And work on continuous improvement, right? It's what can they do better? Definitely we still have gaps in the industry, and there is a lot that at the agricultural level can be done. So.
Do you pretty much agree, Lauren? You're on the same page in that regard, or you have other recommendations for people as well?
Definitely. And what's interesting that you say that most of the time, like when you have a recall and it's an extension level event where a company won't survive it. The company won't survive, but people who are working in the company will survive and they will get new job in the new industry. And I've met a lot of people who went through a recall who said, oh, it was the worst thing that happened in my whole career. And now they're the best food safety ambassador in the whole industry because they know what it is, they know the impact, they know the cause, and they're the best teacher of what it is. And sometimes it's maybe people they don't realize like what's the consequence of not having a perfect food safety plan. It's just you don't know that consequence. But the moment that you've seen it, you've touched it, and you've lived it, I can tell you from there, they're the best ambassador in food safety. Of course, we're not trying to get as much food safety, let's say recalls to create people aware of it, but at least we know that the learnings from each recall, they get transferred to the industry. That's for sure.
Who were you thinking of when you were saying that sometimes people come out of it, specifically, if you don't mind?
No, not at all. Well, I think the one that we know pretty well in Canada, it's Maple Leaf. When Maple Leaf had their recall for this event in 2008, a pretty large company, a lot of people involved in that whole event, whole recall. Right now, Maple Leaf, they're one of the best ambassadors in terms of food safety, in terms of regulation. They're clearly a leader now in food safety. And there's a lot of people who were in the industry when it happened, who lived that transition, and from there are clearly ambassador in terms of food safety. So we don't have to look far in our Canadian food history, and I'm pretty sure that the recall from Danone with the silk milk, almond, all those type of products clearly was an eye-opener for that industry, and clearly going to create a new batch of new ambassadors in terms of food safety.
And Steve, let me add something else. There is a misconception as well that food safety is for the quality department. Food safety encompasses all the departments. It starts from the development, from research and development, goes through the whole operation. And there is no better people to look into quality and food safety than the people that is working with it, right? Communication is huge in these issues. Like, do the communication goes between the departments? Someone that is seeing a gap is sharing what is going on. It is a cross-functional team effort to ensure that food safety works.
Yeah, that point really speaks to me because when I first started putting software technology to help with food safety into companies, what I found was that the food safety coordinators, who, as you mentioned before, were considered sort of an annoying cost center that was interfering with production, they needed to, sort of be empowered. And one of the things that they needed to do was collect data so that they could do the trending and analysis like you're talking about. So what they used to do was, chase all the production people around the facility all day, try to get the information that they needed to do their damn job. That was like almost impossible for them. So what we tried to do was to create a system where different departments within the organization would all use the same centralized platform. And then the data would automatically flow into the food safety program so that you don't have to chase people around for the information that you need. And that's proven to be a pretty good strategy. And I think our clients' products are safer because of it, for sure.
I think also, Steve, the system that you put in place, it became so strong, like the platform that you have with the vendor supplier approval program. It is junior quality professionals think they're struggling with that. But a platform like yours really gives them all the questions, all the answers, not the answers, all the questions of what they have to be asking. And that helps them as well to do their analyticals and approve their suppliers, which is also another big step, right? A big effort to make sure that all the suppliers give you the requirements to comply with your food safety, right?
And keep it up to date. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll have to do a whole nother podcast on supplier verifications, and this is definitely another topic for another day. And just on the technology side, I'll just throw out a couple more things that I think are really emerging that'll really help people, and then maybe Lauren, you can speak to more technology stuff, and if you have anything to add, Sandra, as well, of course. But I think the artificial intelligence that's coming out right now is that we've already integrated parts into our system. So, for example, you can enter in something like slivered onions, and it'll come up and it'll tell you what the hazards are. Before the podcast, I just used our system to decide, to test it. And sure enough, E. coli was one of the front and center hazards that was flagged. So having tools like that to help. And then also on the analytics side. So if you can look at historical data, we found that the sweet spot is about 14 months. You need 14 months of historical data. And then after that, you can start to get good analytics going forward, like predictions. So to do things like to be able to predict a trend and see, as an organization, are we approving or are we swirling down the toilet bowl is quite helpful for a lot of companies. So there's a lot of things like that. And then on the quality side as well, artificial intelligence to look at, vision systems to be able to detect, problems with product and maybe even high-speed production lines. There's so many sensors, there's so many different advances. But what's your take on that, Lauren?
Well, definitely, like when we talk about produce, where we've said that in this case, potentially the problem was the sampling plan where there's too much volume and it's not feasible to test everything. Being able to have a good analytic, to be able to involve AI is going to help improve that sampling plan to be sure that we get the problem right at the right spot with reasonable sampling points and be able to get the most of those sampling points at the right timing. And I think that's going to be a game changer in that industry where, once again, the volume are just gigantic and you can't do tens of thousands of sampling. It's just not feasible. So you have to make the most of them, and tools like that will definitely help to get the most of it.
Would you have anything to add to that, Sandra?
Well, I would be surprised that people are not using AI for this specifically, right? It's became a tool. It just summarizes you everything. I think having access to AI, it has definitely make life easier for many professionals, especially in our field. Again, right? E. coli sources, E. coli varieties, anything that you have in your specification and any result you have, it's there. It's there, so use it, right? Definitely something that if professionals are not using it, I do not understand why.
Okay, so one last plug for your product, Lauren. So once you come out with the E. coli version, you already have the Listeria one, but when you come out with the E. coli, would you be able to treat slivered onions?
Well, it's funny because at first, and it was the conception here that we had with McDonald's where, it was definitely, we thought it was definitely the ground beef that was a source of E. coli, and then realized, oh no, it's the slivered onions. So right now we're really focusing on meat product because, in past year it has always been, the main cause or the main source or the main risk of E. coli. But we're pretty confident that if it works, beef products that are more complex in nature than produce, then definitely it's going to work. So for us, seeing that kind of event definitely is a motivation to push forward and to make it happen as fast as possible.
Okay, well, that's great. Why don't we leave her there? Is there anything else you guys would like to add before we wrap it up?
Food safety is an investment. It's not an expense. I think that's the word of the day.
Okay, fantastic. That's going to be the headline of the podcast, right? So there you go. Okay, well, thank you guys very much. It's been great having you, and hopefully hopefully we'll hook up and chat again sometime.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the invitation. Lauren, nice meeting you.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the FoodTech Innovators Podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion informative and inspiring. If you have any specific topics or questions you'd like us to cover in future episodes, feel free to reach out through social media or email info@icicletechnologies.com. Thanks again, and see you at the next episode of the FoodTech Innovators Podcast.